They would remember the silence first. Before the wind, before the endless fall of white, there was a stillness so profound it felt like the world holding its breath. In the small, hardscrabble settlement of Providence, nestled in a high valley of the Montana Territory, the old hands knew that sound. It was the preamble to death, the hush that precedes the scream of a true winter. They had wood stacked to the eaves, larders full of salted meat and flour, and an unshakable faith in the thick-walled log cabins their fathers and grandfathers had always built. They were prepared. But they had not prepared for the smell of fresh bread. Nor had they prepared for the sight of green herbs growing on a windowsill in the heart of the Great White Death of 1888. They had not prepared for the quiet, steady warmth that radiated not from a roaring, gluttonous fire, but from a wall of stone. And they had certainly not prepared to be saved by the one soul in the valley they had all condemned as a fool. His name was Elias Thorne, and in the autumn of that year he was little more than a ghost himself. At 20, he possessed the lanky, unfinished frame of a boy who had outgrown his strength too quickly. He had arrived a few months prior, a stranger from the East, with nothing to his name but a deed to a worthless patch of stony ground a mile from the settlement proper, a threadbare coat, and a leather-bound journal left to him by his late father. He was an orphan, twice over, his mother taken by fever when he was a child, his father by a fall from a city scaffold just a year ago. Providence was a place built on conviction. Conviction in strength, in tradition, in the unyielding power of axe and timber against the wilderness. The men of the town were carved from the same hard material as the mountains that surrounded them. Their leader, in all but name, was Silas Croft, a master builder whose family had settled this valley. Croft was a man of immense physical presence, with a beard the color of iron filings and hands that could crush stone. He built cabins the way he lived his life, with brute force, massive logs, and a deep suspicion of anything new. His cabins were fortresses, thick, hand-hewn timbers, meticulously notched and chinked with a mixture of mud and moss. The windows were small, grudging concessions to the light, mere slits against the cold. The heart of every Croft cabin was a massive cast-iron stove, a black, pot-bellied god that demanded constant tribute of oak and pine. To the people of Providence, this was not just a method, it was gospel. It was the only way to survive. Elias, however, had no means to build such a fortress. The small inheritance he'd received had been devoured by the journey west and the filing of the deed. He owned the land, a sloping piece of earth facing south, dismissed by everyone as Croft's Folly, because the soil was too thin for farming and too steep for easy building. His only assets were his own 2 hands and his father's journal. The journal was not the diary of a frontiersman. Elias's father had been no adventurer. He had been a quiet, scholarly man, an assistant to an architect in Philadelphia, a man obsessed with light and heat, with the elegant greenhouses of Europe and the strange, nascent science of thermodynamics. The journal was filled not with tales of survival, but with delicate, precise ink drawings of glass structures, cross-sections of stone walls, and pages of dense, elegant script detailing concepts Elias was only beginning to understand. Thermal mass, convection, insulation, the astonishing ability of glass to trap the sun's warmth. As the first hints of autumn began to paint the aspens in strokes of violent gold, a palpable anxiety settled over Providence. The days grew shorter, the nights sharpened with a crystalline cold. The talk in the general store was of past winters, of the blue norther of '76 that had frozen cattle standing in the fields. Fuel was the currency of survival, and every waking hour was spent felling, splitting, and stacking the wood that would mean the difference between life and death. Elias watched and listened. He saw the immense labor, the mountains of wood required to feed the insatiable iron stoves. He saw the dark interiors of the cabins, gloomy even at midday. And in the pages of his father's journal, he saw a different path, a dangerous, untried path. One crisp September morning, he walked into the Providence Mercantile, the center of the town's commercial and social life. The store's owner, a shrewd man named Abernathy, sat behind the counter, his ledger open before him. Silas Croft was there, leaning against a barrel of nails, holding court with two other settlers. The air was thick with the smell of coffee, leather, and impending winter. Elias, his voice barely rising above a murmur, made his request. He didn't ask for much. A small loan, credit for nails, a few tools, perhaps some tar paper. He had a plan, he explained, to build his shelter. Abernathy peered at him over his spectacles. A plan? The only plan that works here, son, is a Croft cabin. You got the silver for the logs? For the stove? No, sir, Elias said quietly. My design is different. It doesn't require as much timber or a large stove. Silas Croft let out a short, barking laugh. He pushed himself off the barrel and ambled over, looking down at Elias from his considerable height. Different? Boy, the cold out here doesn't care for different. It's a simple beast. You fight it with thick walls and a hot fire. What foolishness have you cooked up? Hesitantly, Elias spoke of his idea. A south-facing wall, made mostly of glass. A thick stone wall behind it to hold the day's heat, a roof dug into the hillside. The moment the word glass left his lips, the store fell silent. Croft stared at him, his expression shifting from derision to disbelief. Then he threw his head back and roared with laughter, a deep, booming sound that shook the floorboards. The other men joined in, snickering into their hands. Glass? Croft finally gasped, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. A wall of glass? In a Montana blizzard? Son, have you lost your mind? The first wind will shatter it to pieces. The first frost will suck every bit of warmth you have right through it. You'll be a block of ice by Christmas. He turned to Abernathy, clapping him on the shoulder. Don't waste your ink on this one. He's building his own tomb. Abernathy, who respected Croft's judgment above all else, shook his head at Elias. No credit, no loan. The boy is a fool. It was a sentence, a public declaration of his failure, delivered with the casual cruelty of absolute certainty. Elias felt the heat of shame rise in his cheeks, but beneath it, something else was hardening, a cold, quiet resolve. He looked from Croft's mocking face to Abernathy's dismissive one. He gave a single, curt nod, turned without another word, and walked out of the store, the sound of their laughter following him into the cold, bright air. He was alone, utterly and completely. But he had the journal. That very day, he began. He returned not to his barren plot, but to the history of the valley itself. With a borrowed handcart, he began a pilgrimage to the places of failure, the abandoned homesteads and prospectors' shacks that littered the surrounding hills, monuments to dreams that had withered and died. These places were graveyards of hope, but to Elias, they were treasure troves. Every settler, in their initial optimism, had packed a few precious panes of glass for their first small cabin. When they failed or moved on, they took the heavy stoves and tools, but the fragile, awkward windows were often left behind. Elias became a scavenger of light. He spent weeks trekking through forgotten gulches and overgrown clearings, carefully prying dusty, cracked panes of glass from their rotting frames. Each piece was a victory. A small, 9-pane sash from a collapsed miner's shack. 4 larger panes from a homestead abandoned after a fire. A single, beautiful piece of wavy, bubbled glass from the door of what was once a small schoolhouse. He was a collector of ghosts, of shattered visions. He built a careful wooden crate padded with dried grass and began to fill it, piece by mismatched piece. The labor was immense. The handcart groaned under the weight, its iron-rimmed wheels screeching in protest as he hauled his fragile cargo back to his land. He learned the grammar of pain, the deep ache in his lower back, the burning of his shoulders, the raw, blistered skin of his hands. He ate little, subsisting on dried meat and the small wild onions he found growing near creek beds. He grew thinner, his face smudged with the dirt of his lonely work, but his eyes held a new intensity. Back at his plot, the second phase of labor began. He was not building on the land, he was building with it. Using a pick and shovel he'd bought with his last few coins, he began to excavate. He was not leveling a foundation, but digging into the south-facing slope of the hill itself, creating a 3-sided pit, 10 feet deep at the back, tapering to ground level at the front. The north, west, and east walls of his home would be the earth itself. The earth was a perfect insulator, a concept his father had written about at length. It did not create heat, but it held it, stubbornly refusing to yield it to the winter air. This work was brutal. The ground was a stubborn mix of clay and stone. Every shovelful was a battle. Rocks, from the size of a fist to the size of a cannonball, had to be pried out and rolled away. He saved every single one. They were not obstacles, they were building materials. The pile of dark, heavy stones grew day by day, a testament to his unyielding effort. The valley soil, a dense red clay, was piled separately. He knew its purpose from the journal's diagrams. As September bled into October, the shape of his folly began to emerge. A deep cut in the hillside, facing due south. The men from Providence would sometimes ride out on hunting trips and pause on the ridge above his land. They'd point and laugh. "Look at the mole boy," one would jeer, "digging his own grave to save on the funeral costs." Silas Croft came by once. He sat atop his powerful horse, watching Elias, covered head to toe in red mud, wrestling a large rock from the earth. He didn't even bother to shout a taunt. He just shook his head slowly, a look of profound pity on his face, the look one gives to the hopelessly lost. Elias ignored them. He was not in their world anymore. He was in the world of the journal, a world of physics and elegant, natural laws. He was in a conversation with his father, the quiet architect's assistant, who seemed to speak to him from the ink-stained pages. "The sun is a furnace, 93 million miles away," one entry read. "A furnace that burns for free. Any man who builds a house in a cold climate without considering its path is a fool, no matter how thick his walls." Now came the most critical part, the 2 walls that would form the living space. The north wall, the one set deepest into the earth, was the anchor. This was the thermal battery. Using the stones he had painstakingly excavated, he began to build. It was a slow, agonizing process. He had no mortar, no cement. He was using a technique from the oldest pages of the journal, a method his father had copied from a book on ancient Roman villas. A dry stack wall, fitted together with nothing but gravity and friction. He would find 2 stones, study their shapes for long minutes, then turn them over and over until they locked together like puzzle pieces. It was a conversation with geology, a negotiation with physics. Slowly, painstakingly, the wall rose. It was 4 feet thick, a massive, solid barrier of granite and basalt, dark and dense. It was ugly, uneven, a chaotic tapestry of rock. But it was solid. When he laid his hand against it, it felt ancient, permanent. This wall was designed to do one thing: absorb heat. It would be his stored sun. For the east and west walls, he turned to the pile of clay. He mixed it with water he hauled in buckets from a nearby stream and with dried grasses he cut from the hillside. He stomped it with his bare feet until it was a thick, uniform paste. This was cob, one of humanity's oldest building materials. He packed this mud mixture in and around a rough timber frame, building up the earthen walls layer by layer, smoothing them with his hands. They were extensions of the hill itself, seamless and solid. Finally, with the first snowflakes of the season beginning to drift in the air, it was time for the south wall, the wall of glass. His collection of salvaged panes was a motley assortment of sizes and shapes. Building a solid wall from them seemed impossible, but his father's journal had a solution: a heavy post and beam frame. Using the last of his money, he bought a few rough-sawn timbers from a small, independent mill far down the valley, avoiding the judgmental eyes of Providence. He built a sturdy grid, a skeleton of wood with dozens of openings of varying sizes. This was his canvas. For 2 weeks, he worked with the delicacy of a jeweler. He measured each salvaged window, each loose pane. He cut and shaped the openings in the timber frame to match. He used his clay and straw mixture as a sealant, packing it carefully around each piece of glass, creating a perfect, airtight seal. He was creating a mosaic of captured light. But he didn't stop there. The journal was adamant about the next step. A single pane of glass was not enough. It would lose too much heat at night. He needed to create an air gap, a layer of insulation. So for every pane he installed on the outer frame, he installed a second, corresponding pane on an inner frame, leaving a 3-inch gap of still air between them. He was, in effect, inventing the double-paned window out of sheer necessity and salvaged scraps. The result was bizarre. It was a patchwork quilt of transparency, a chaotic jumble of squares and rectangles, some clear, some wavy, some with small cracks he had carefully sealed with pine pitch. It was an affront to every principle of frontier architecture. It was, as Silas Croft had named it, a monumental folly. By mid-November, the structure was complete. A low-slung cabin, half buried in the earth, 3 walls of dirt and a thick stone back, and one entire wall of glittering, mismatched glass facing the low southern sun. From the inside, it was magical. The sun, now hanging low in the sky for most of the day, poured through the glass wall, unimpeded. The light was dazzling, filling the small space. And the physics began to work. The direct sunlight struck the thick, dark stone wall at the back of the cabin. All day long, the stone drank the light, absorbing its thermal energy. When Elias pressed his palm to it in the late afternoon, it was distinctly, miraculously, warm to the touch. As the sun set, the air outside would plummet to freezing temperatures. But inside the cabin, something amazing happened. The stone wall, now warmer than the air in the room, began to radiate its stored heat back into the small space. It was a slow, gentle, persistent warmth, like a sleeping giant breathing heat into the room all night long. He needed only the smallest of fires in a tiny stove he'd built from a metal drum, just for cooking and a bit of extra warmth in the deep of the night. His woodpile was laughably small, a mere fraction of the log fortresses in Providence. He had done it. He was living inside his father's theories. The first real test came in early December. A week of heavy snow and temperatures that hovered around zero. In Providence, the iron stoves ran day and night, their smoke a constant, dark plume against the white landscape. In his sun-trap cabin, Elias was comfortable. During the day, with the sun out, the cabin was so warm he had to vent it. At night, he slept under a single blanket, the radiant heat from the stone wall keeping the chill at bay. He had built a small planter box against the stone wall, and the parsley and thyme seeds he had carefully carried from the east had sprouted. Green, living things in the heart of a dying world. The final judgment, however, was yet to come. The old hands in the valley had been talking about it for months, a feeling in their bones, a look in the sky. They said a winter like this only came once in a generation. They called it a breather, a winter that held its breath before it tried to kill you. On the third week of January, the breath was released. It would be known later as the Great Stillness, or the White Hurricane of '88. It did not arrive with a roar, but with that terrible, profound silence. The sky turned a strange, bruised purple gray. The wind died completely. A fine, powdery snow began to fall, not in flakes, but in a dense, vertical curtain, as if the sky itself were dissolving. And the temperature began to fall, not by degrees, but by tens of degrees, from 10 above zero to 5 below, then to 15 below. The mercury in the official thermometer outside the Providence Mercantile seemed to shrink in terror, finally settling at a staggering 25 degrees below zero. And it stayed there for a day, then 2, then 3. The world outside Elias's glass wall vanished. There was no sky, no ground, no horizon, only a churning, vertical river of white. The sun was gone, a memory. This was the test the journal could not have predicted. Without the sun, his thermal battery could not recharge. For the first time, a sliver of fear pierced his confidence. The stone wall, his silent, warm companion, would eventually grow cold. He had enough wood for his small stove to last a week, maybe 10 days if he was careful. How long would the storm last? In Providence, it was a catastrophe. The world had shrunk to the space of a single room, a battleground between the fire and the cold. The log cabins, which had seemed so invincible, were failing. The brutal cold was like a physical pressure, finding every tiny crack, every unchinked gap. The air near the walls was arctic. Frost began to creep inward from the window panes, crystalline traceries of failure. The true crisis was the fuel. The iron stoves, the pride of the valley, became black tyrants. They devoured wood with an insatiable, terrifying hunger. A cord of wood that should have lasted a week was gone in 2 days. The immense stacks, the symbols of their foresight and security, were shrinking at an alarming rate. Men who had laughed at Elias's tiny woodpile now looked at their own dwindling supply with stark terror. Silas Croft's cabin, the best built in the valley, was a fortress under siege. He had 2 stoves running, and still the cold pressed in. His wife and 2 young daughters were huddled in the center of the main room, wrapped in every blanket they owned. The windows were opaque with thick, fern-like patterns of ice. On the morning of the 4th day, Silas went to his woodpile. It was half gone. A cold dread, colder than the air, settled in his stomach. He had planned for a hard winter, but this was not winter. This was an execution. He thought of the others, the Miller family, whose cabin was older, less sturdy, the widow Jensen, and then an image flashed in his mind, the fool boy, Elias Thorne. He pictured the flimsy wall of glass shattered by the cold. He imagined the boy, frozen solid in his half-dug hole, a monument to his own arrogance. It was a grim thought, but it was followed by another, more practical one. The boy lived near the Henleys, a young couple with a newborn baby. Their cabin was small, and Croft had worried about its construction. Pride warred with duty. He had no business going out in this. It was suicide. But the thought of the Henley baby, of that young family, gnawed at him. He told himself that was the reason. He would go check on the Henleys, and on the way he would pass the boy's land. He could at least confirm the inevitable, see the final result of such profound foolishness. The preparation was like dressing for a polar expedition. Layers of wool, his thickest buffalo hide coat, fur-lined gloves and boots. He wrapped his face in scarves until only his eyes were visible. When he opened the cabin door, the cold was not a sensation. It was a physical blow, a solid thing that stole the breath from his lungs and burned his eyes. His horse, a hardy mountain breed, whinnied in protest. The snow was waist-deep, a fine, dry powder that offered no purchase. Every step was a struggle. The world was a maelstrom of white noise and blinding chaos. There were no landmarks. He navigated by instinct alone, by the feel of the land beneath the snow. The wind drove the snow like sand, scouring his exposed skin, freezing his eyelashes together. It took him nearly 2 hours to travel a single mile. He was exhausted, his body screaming in protest, his core temperature dropping dangerously. He found the Henleys' cabin half buried in a drift, a thin, pathetic wisp of smoke rising from its chimney. He hammered on the door, and when young Mr. Henley opened it, Croft was shocked. The man's face was pale, his lips blue. Inside, the cabin was frigid. Their wood was almost gone. The baby was crying, a thin, weak sound. "We're freezing, Mr. Croft," Henley said, his teeth chattering. "The wood's nearly out. We won't last another night." A sense of terrible responsibility washed over Croft. He had built this cabin. He had told them it was enough. He looked at the terror in their eyes and saw his own failure. "Huddle together," he commanded, his voice hoarse. "I'll be back." He turned his horse toward Elias's land. It was closer than returning to the settlement. He wasn't sure what he would do. Maybe he could break up the boy's flimsy furniture for the Henleys' stove. At least the fool's death could serve some purpose. He pushed on, the wind at his back now, a malevolent force shoving him toward the site of the folly. He almost missed it. The cabin was so low to the ground, so buried in snow, that it was nearly invisible. A white mound against a white hill. He was about to ride past when he saw it. A light. It wasn't the flickering, desperate light of a fire. It was a soft, steady, golden glow radiating from the spot where the glass wall should be. Croft stopped his horse, blinking, certain his frozen eyes were deceiving him. He slid from the saddle, his legs numb and clumsy, and staggered forward. The snow was drifted high against the south wall, but the upper panes of glass were still visible. He peered through one, and the world fell away. It was like looking into another season. The air inside was still, the light was bright and calm, and there, sitting at a small wooden table in the center of the room, was Elias Thorne. He was in his shirt sleeves. He was reading a book. On the windowsill next to him, a small pot of green herbs reached toward the light. The air was not just bright, it looked warm, soft, alive. There was no roaring fire. The small cookstove in the corner was dark. Croft's mind simply refused to process what he was seeing. It was impossible. A lie. A hallucination brought on by the cold. He stumbled back, fell to his knees in the snow. He was a master builder. He knew the laws of cold and heat, of wood and winter. What he was seeing defied all of them. It was a miracle, or a trick. He crawled to the simple plank door at the side of the cabin and hammered on it with a frozen glove. His fist made a dull, weak thud. The door opened. Elias stood there, his face calm, his expression one of mild curiosity. A wave of heat rolled out of the cabin, a tangible thing that felt like summer. It smelled of warm stone, of earth, and faintly of baking bread. Croft stared at him, speechless. The scarves around his face were stiff with frozen breath. He tried to speak, but only a choked gasp came out. "How?" he finally whispered, the word a plume of white vapor. Elias looked at him, then at the raging blizzard behind him, and seemed to understand. He simply stepped aside. "Come in," he said. "You're letting the cold in." Stepping into that cabin was like stepping out of reality. The transition was so abrupt, so total, that Croft felt a wave of dizziness. The violence of the storm vanished, replaced by a profound and gentle quiet. The warmth was not the scorching, dry heat of an iron stove. It was a pervasive, radiant heat that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It soaked into his frozen bones, into the very marrow of him. He fumbled with his frozen coat, his fingers too numb to work the buttons. Elias helped him, his own hands nimble and warm. Croft's eyes darted around the small space. It was simple, almost monastic. A bed in one corner, the table, a few shelves. The east and west walls were smooth, hard-packed earth. The south wall was the impossible mosaic of light. And the north wall? He walked toward it, compelled. It was the massive, ugly wall of dry, stacked stone. He reached out a trembling hand and laid it flat against the rock. It was warm. Not hot, not burning, just deeply, fundamentally warm. The heat was radiating from it in soft, steady waves. He finally understood. The wall was a reservoir. It was breathing yesterday's sun into the room. "The sun is gone," Croft said, his voice thick with disbelief. "It's been 4 days." "The wall holds the heat for a long time," Elias explained, his voice even and calm. "It's 4 feet thick. It takes days for the cold to penetrate. By then, the sun will be back." He gestured to the small cook stove. "I use that for an hour in the morning and an hour at night. It's enough." Croft sank onto a small stool, his powerful body trembling with cold and the shock of revelation. He had built fortresses to fight the winter. This boy had built a trap to capture the summer. All his life, all his work, his entire philosophy was a lie. He had been fighting a war with brute strength when the answer was intelligence, subtlety, wisdom. He looked at Elias, at this thin, quiet boy he had mocked and dismissed. He saw not a fool, but a prophet. Then he remembered. The Henleys. The baby. "There's a family," he croaked, shame and desperation warring in his voice. "The Henleys, a mile from here. They're freezing. Their wood is gone." Elias didn't hesitate. He didn't gloat. He didn't say, "I told you so." He simply nodded. "Bring them here," he said. It took another hour, another Herculean effort against the storm, but Croft brought them back. He half carried the young father, while Elias, dressed now in his own warm coat, helped the mother and her bundled infant. They stumbled into the warmth of the sun-trapped cabin like refugees finding an impossible shore. That night, as the white hurricane reached its zenith, howling over the buried landscape, a tiny fool's cabin, dug into a hill, became an ark. Silas Croft, the master builder, sat on the floor, his back against the warm stone wall, watching a newborn baby sleep peacefully in a wooden crate near the glowing herbs. The Henley parents were asleep, exhausted, saved. And Elias Thorne sat at his table, his father's journal open before him, reading by the light of a single candle, its small flame barely disturbing the profound, warm stillness of the room. Croft watched him for a long time. The boy who had built a house of light and warmth in the heart of the darkness. Finally, Croft spoke, his voice quiet and heavy with the weight of his admission. "I was wrong," he said. Elias looked up from his book. "Everything," Croft continued, gesturing around the small, miraculous room. "I was wrong about everything. I built walls to keep the cold out. You built a home that invited the sun in. Will you teach me?" The storm broke 2 days later. The sky cleared to a brilliant, painful blue. The world was a blanket of silent, pristine white, the sun glittering on it like a field of diamonds. When Silas Croft and the Henley family emerged from the sun trap, they were met with a scene of devastation. The settlement of Providence looked like a war zone. Several outlying cabins had been completely buried, chimneys had collapsed, and the wood piles were gone. The story spread like wildfire, carried by a humbled Silas Croft. The story of the Fool Boy's glass house. The story of the warm stone wall. The story of the green, growing things. The story of survival, not by brute force, but by quiet wisdom. That spring, there were no taunts, no mockery. Instead, a procession of men, the same men who had laughed in the general store, made their way to Elias Thorne's plot of land. They did not come with derision, but with notebooks and pencils in their calloused hands. At their head was Silas Croft. They came to learn. Elias, quiet and unassuming as ever, taught them. He did not lecture, he showed them. He walked them through the principles in his father's journal. He taught them how to orient a house to the path of the sun. He taught them the patient art of the dry stack stone wall, the ancient craft of mixing cob. He showed them how to salvage, how to see a resource where they once saw only waste. The transformation of the valley did not happen overnight. It happened one house at a time. The first project was retrofitting the Henleys' cabin. They built a massive stone wall along the inside of the north wall. They added a small, south-facing glassed-in porch, a miniature version of Elias's wall. The next winter, the Henleys used less than a third of the wood they had before. Silas Croft, the valley's master builder, became Elias's most devoted student. He tore down the north wall of his own grand cabin and replaced it with a stone wall 5 feet thick. He expanded his small southern windows, creating a sunroom that glowed with light. The man who had once worshipped the iron stove now preached the gospel of thermal mass. The banker, Abernathy, who had denied Elias a loan, came to him personally, hat in hand, and offered him an unlimited line of credit. "Build whatever you want, son," he'd said. "Just show us how." Elias never became a rich man. He never sought power or acclaim. He remained on his small plot of land in his quiet, sun-trapped cabin. But he became the valley's heart. His father's journal, once a private inheritance, became a public text, its pages copied and shared, its diagrams the blueprints for a new way of life. Years passed. The settlement of Providence grew, and it grew in a unique way. The houses were no longer dark fortresses huddled against the cold. They were bright, intelligent structures that worked in partnership with the world around them. A visitor to the valley in winter would have seen a remarkable sight: an entire town of south-facing glass walls, glittering in the low golden sun, catching and holding the light. And on the coldest days, when other frontier towns were choked with the smoke of 1,000 desperate fires, the air in Providence was clear and still. The only sign of life, the warm, steady glow emanating from the windows of the Suntrap homes. The legacy of the Fool Boy was a valley that had learned, finally, not to fight the winter, but to dance with the sun.